In 2016, I was procrastinating an essay on Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies and splashed the cash on Battlefield 1. Now, I hate EA's microtransfers as much as the next guy, but there was no doubt about it, this was a pretty immersive experience and not a bad game. However, that's about as close as I've gotten to the horrors of the First World War, or any tragedy of anywhere near that magnitude. And so it might seem easy for me to talk about how good the God of the Bible is as I'm writing this script from the privileged suburban apartment that I live in. But when faced with real tragedy and the brokenness of this world, it drove C.S. Lewis to repeat the mantra of the poet Lucretius: had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. Having been brought up in the Christian faith, Lewis could not believe in a God who would have firstly allowed his mother to die from cancer when he was just 9, and then secondly allowed him and his fellow Europeans to lie dead in the mud of the Western Front. Yet this was the guy who went on to write Mere Christianity, the most famous 20th century Christian book, and then The Chronicles of Narnia, the most famous piece of Christian fiction. And in this video, I'll explain to you exactly how all of that happened.
Hello there.
So, if you're looking to read C.S. Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, this is no substitute. However, if you want a 10-minute rundown on his life, this is the place to be, and make sure to let YouTube's algorithm know by leaving a like on this video. So, though formerly named Clive Staples, Lewis was known by the name Jack as he grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Like I said at the start, his mother died when Jack was just 9, and this hit him hard because he was much closer with his mother than with his father. A talented writer who was obsessed with writing novels about talking animals, at age 18, Jack moved to study at Oxford as part of the officers' training corps. Now, at this time, during World War I might I add, he was an aspiring poet, but though his writing was exceptional, his poetry was tougher to follow. Well, apparently it was. I'll be honest, as evidenced by the fact that I referenced I play Battlefield, I find all poetry tough to follow. I'm sure someone who either searched up C.S. Lewis or found this video on a recommended would be a much better judge of his poetry than I would, so go check it out. But as a history teacher, what I do know much better is World War I. And in November of 1917, Jack was stationed to the Somme, and then in April 1918, he saw combat for the first time as he helped Britain defend against Ludendorff's counter-offensive, Germany's last roll of the dice in the war. Now, before seeing combat, Jack had a friend in the army called Paddy, and the two of them made a pact that if one of them were to die in the war, then the other would take care of that person's family. Sure enough, Paddy did indeed die in the war, and this did two things for Jack. Firstly, having become an atheist in his teens, it cemented his belief that the faith of his mother was misplaced because if there was a just God, a horror like this could never happen. And then secondly, he actually followed through on his promise and sought to take care of Paddy's mother, Janie Moore. When they met, Janie was 45 and Lewis was 18, and they lived together as he followed through on his promise. So the question I'm sure you're asking is, did something, let's say, more than platonic happen between the two of them? And my answer to that is possibly, but it's not confirmed. Remember that for most of his life he didn't actually have a mother figure, and so it's not unsurprising that in this new undefined relationship, the impression that the two gave off was that lines were a little blurred. As he returned from the war, he also graduated in classics and English literature and would then lecture at Oxford. Now, while at Oxford, every lunchtime he'd head to the pub with his good faculty friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, who, I don't need to tell you, wrote Lord of the Rings. The two had very lively discussions and didn't know how to do small talk, and there was an epic contest of ideas between Lewis's atheism and Tolkien's Catholicism. Unconvinced, he remained an atheist and then in 1926 released Dyma, his big narrative poem, which flopped pretty hard. Having underwhelmed at poetry, he then started to find his niche in medieval literature and then lectured in Spenser, Shakespeare and Milton. Now, hold on to that detail because the medieval bit will be really important when we get to Narnia. Now, still an atheist, in 1929, Lewis returned to see his father for the first time in a decade. And that 10-year absence was what Jack would later describe as the worst sin of his life, and the two spent 6 weeks together before Jack departed, and then 4 days after Jack departed, his father died. Yet this time, rather than his suffering driving him further towards atheism, it actually drove him away from it. As Lewis said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And realizing that the very thing that initially drove him away from the idea of God was logically inconsistent, he converted. Not to Christianity, but to theism. As Lewis said, he could see the attraction of Christianity because it provided comfort, but he just couldn't see how he could possibly believe it to be true. And so on his conversion to theism, Jack said that he was perhaps the most dejected and reluctant convert of all of England. And so fast forward to 1931, and while walking with Tolkien and fellow author Hugo Dyson, C.S. Lewis asked a pretty clever question. Why were there so many ancient myths that involved a young man god dying and coming back to life? how do you distinguish between Jesus and them? Tolkien answered the question by saying that Christianity is indeed a myth, it's just a true myth. And because this was the only right story of the universe, it positions all other mythological stories. As a renowned story writer, this struck Lewis. Of course, it would make sense that an infinitely complex god would have a story of his plan for humanity that had all of the imaginative power that the ancient Norse myths had. But it would have the one major difference of it being a true myth. Rather than God simply just say who he is, he showed it in the greatest story of his character, dying on the cross for humanity. And so, while on the way to the zoo of all places, Jack converted to Christianity. Now, much to Tolkien's disappointment, Lewis joined the Church of England rather than the Catholic Church, and he wrote two of his most notable works straight away. Firstly, he wrote the Screwtape Letters, a fictional account of Satan's henchmen reporting back to him on the different methods they used to drive people away from God. And then secondly, he wrote The Problem of Pain, which sought to provide an academic theological argument as to why a good God allows pain, and how pain isn't evidence that a good God doesn't exist. More on this later though. Now, if you're a regular on the channel, I don't need to tell you that in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and then after invading France in 1940, Germany started its bombing raids on London. And so the most notable voice being broadcast on radio was obviously Winston Churchill, but I think after Churchill it's fair to say that Lewis was next. You see, during World War II, the BBC asked Jack to give broadcasts on Christianity, probably to boost the morale by giving people hope beyond the crisis. The broadcasts were remarkably popular, and after the war they were formed into his most famous book, Mere Christianity. The book has 4 sections. Firstly, an observation of God in the universe. Secondly, an explanation for what Christians believe. Thirdly, an explanation for how Christians are to behave. And then finally, it concludes with a section on the triune nature of God. The most recent estimate is that over 200 million copies of this book have been sold. And the book has some pretty iconic quotes, such as, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." And it also included Lewis's famous assertion that Jesus could only be one of 3 things: the Lord, a liar, or a lunatic. Lewis's writing obviously grew in popularity after the war, and whenever he spoke, lecture halls couldn't fit in all of the audience. However, Oxford wasn't too impressed that he had such popularity with the common folk as well as academia, and this was the beginning of a cold relationship between the two. Now, in 1948, Lewis debated a woman by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe. He had made the argument that if matter decided everything, for example if someone robbed a bank because they had more of a certain chemical in their brain, then there could be no absolute truth. Now, Anscombe, a devout Catholic, simply replied, "Well, when you step on a scale and it tells you your weight, is that not matter telling the absolute truth?" And so after years of schooling people in the Oxford halls, Lewis was humiliated, and this really rocked his confidence as he stopped writing in the field of apologetics. Apologetics is basically shorthand for an intellectual defense of the Christian faith. Instead, he turned to fiction and he wrote the iconic Narnia series. And I don't need to convince anyone that this series is clearly an allegory for Christianity. Aslan is clearly Jesus in the story. However, what you might not pick up is Lewis's medieval background coming out in the story. Throughout different periods of church history, there's been different explanations for exactly how Jesus atoned for humanity's sin on the cross. Lewis's church, the Church of England, taught an idea called penal substitution. And just to declare my bias early, this is the one I agree with. Basically, the idea is simple. Jesus was substituted in for us and was punished as though he was us and as though he was sin. And because he bore the punishment, the price of sin had been paid. However, in Narnia, the death of Aslan was much more typical of what we call the ransom theory, which was the main theory of atonement up until the 11th century AD. The theory goes that the death of Jesus was a ransom sacrifice paid to Satan himself, but the devil was tricked by not realizing that Christ could rise from the dead. In Narnia, Aslan dies instead of Edmund, but then rises to life again using powers that the witch does not know he has. And so I'll finish lastly with Lewis's personal life. Throughout the 1950s, he played the role of the great carer. In 1951, Mrs. Moore died and Lewis cared for her right up until then. His brother Warren, also known as Warnie, was an alcoholic that needed constant care. He'd served in both wars, and so Jack was so willing to help his brother out in his time of great need. Then in 1956, Jack met a woman by the name of Joy who had taken her 2 sons to England from America to flee her abusive husband. Like Lewis, she was an ex-atheist convert, and Jack agreed to marry her to help her move to England. However, as Lewis was growing an affection for his new wife, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer and died in 1960. This would then lead Jack to write his second book on suffering, Grief Observed. Unlike The Problem of Pain, Jack offered no attempt of explaining suffering from an academic point of view. He merely just poured out his grief, and on the 22nd of November 1963, Lewis died of kidney failure. You might also recognise that day because on that day both JFK and Aldous Huxley were also killed. Almost no one came to Lewis's burial. Thanks for watching. It's quite a sad finish to the life of C.S. Lewis, but he was adamant that in being with Jesus, his desires that were so unsatisfied on earth finally would be. I'd thoroughly recommend you checking out any of his books, and if you want to watch something else, check out this similar video we made on the pastor killed by Hitler, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history. Oh, by the way, I've got COVID.